Sometimes the hardest thing in life is opening your door to a stranger when you've spent years learning to keep it closed. For Thorne, a mountain man living alone in the Montana Rockies, that moment came on the coldest night of winter. An old woman appeared at his cabin, half frozen and desperate, begging for shelter until morning. He should have turned her away like he'd done with every other drifter, but something in her eyes stopped him. By the fire that night, she would tell him a story that connected their lives in ways he never imagined, a story about family, broken promises, and a debt that went back decades. What she revealed would change everything he thought he knew about his past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thorne had built his cabin 15 years ago in a place where most men wouldn't dare to live. It sat at the edge of a pine forest, backed against a granite cliff face that rose another 1,000 feet into the Montana sky. The nearest settlement, a town called Ridgeline, lay 3 days' hard ride through mountain passes that could kill a man if he didn't know what he was doing. Thorne knew what he was doing. He'd spent half his life in these mountains, learning their moods, their dangers, their grudging mercies. The cabin itself was solid work. Thick logs, chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, and shutters that could be barred from the inside against winter storms or worse. Inside, everything had its place. A rope bed in one corner with wool blankets and a bearskin, a table and single chair, shelves holding tin plates, a coffee pot, salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, his rifle above the door, traps and snares hanging from wall pegs, a leather journal worn at the edges, tucked beneath his bedroll where he hadn't looked at it in years. He was 54 years old, though the mirror, if he'd owned one, would have shown a man who could pass for older. His face was weathered like old leather, creased deep around the eyes and mouth. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly grey and hung past his collar. His hands were scarred and capable, the hands of a man who'd done hard work his entire life and expected to keep doing it until he died. Which, he figured, wouldn't be in some bed surrounded by people. It would be out here, one way or another. That suited him fine. His only companion was a dog named Buck, a mixed breed with wolf somewhere in his bloodline. Buck had wandered up to the cabin 4 winters back, half-starved, and Thorne had made the mistake of feeding him. The dog stayed, and Thorne discovered he didn't mind the company as much as he'd thought he would. Buck didn't ask questions, didn't expect conversation, just lay by the fire on cold nights and followed Thorne on his trapline, useful for warning about bears or mountain lions. Thorne's days followed a pattern that varied only with the seasons. Up before dawn, coffee and whatever he had for breakfast. Check the traps in a circuit that took most of the day, beaver, marten, fox, whatever the mountains offered. Skin and cure the pelts. Chop wood, haul water from the spring. Hunt when the meat supply ran low. In summer he'd gather berries, dig roots, catch fish from the high lakes. In fall, he'd take his furs down to Ridgeline, trade for supplies, powder, shot, flour, coffee, tobacco, and come back up before the first snows closed the passes. People in Ridgeline knew him by sight but not by story. He didn't drink in the saloon or linger in town. The trading post owner, a man named Garrett, was the closest thing Thorne had to a friend, and even Garrett knew better than to ask personal questions. Once, years back, someone had pressed him about where he'd come from, what he'd done before the mountains. Thorne had simply looked at the man until the silence became uncomfortable, then walked away. No one asked again. But Thorne hadn't always been this way. There'd been a time when he'd lived among people, when he'd had a place in the world below these peaks. He'd been a different man then, younger, less careful with his heart. He'd served as a territorial scout and ranger, riding patrol through frontier settlements, keeping peace where peace could be kept. He'd married a woman named Catherine, a settler's daughter with dark hair and a laugh that could warm a room. They'd built a small ranch on grassland near the Bitterroot Valley, run a few head of cattle, planted a garden. They'd had a son, a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. That life had ended in a single season, 20 years ago. Thorne had been away on a long patrol, tracking horse thieves through the backcountry. When he'd returned home 6 weeks later, Catherine was dead. The neighbors said it had been a fever, quick and merciless. His son, just 5 years old, was gone. Taken in by another family, they told him, but when Thorne pressed for details, the answers were vague. The family had moved on, headed west. No one seemed to know exactly where. Or if they did, they wouldn't say. Thorne had searched. God knows he'd searched. Spent 2 years riding from settlement to settlement, following rumors and dead ends, growing more desperate and wild-eyed, until people started crossing the street to avoid him. He'd found nothing. It was as if his son had vanished into the vast territory like smoke, and the not knowing had been worse than death. Death had edges you could grip, a shape you could understand. But this endless uncertainty, this horrible possibility that his boy was alive somewhere, growing up without him, maybe thinking his father had abandoned him, that had broken something inside Thorne that couldn't be fixed. So he'd come to the mountains, he'd built this cabin. He'd chosen isolation, because isolation couldn't betray you. Up here, there were no lies, no false hopes, no neighbors with sympathetic eyes and empty words. Just rock and timber and weather. Honest things, cruel sometimes, but honest. The old journal under his bedroll held the last pieces of that former life. He'd written in it during the early days of his marriage, brief entries about the work of building a ranch, about Catherine's garden, about teaching his son to ride. He hadn't opened it in 15 years, couldn't bear to. The words inside belonged to a man who'd believed the world made sense, who'd thought love and hard work were enough. That man was dead, in every way that mattered. Now, in late November, with winter settling its weight on the high country, Thorne was preparing for the months ahead. He'd laid in his supplies on the last trip to Ridgeline 3 weeks ago. His woodpile was stacked high against the cabin's north wall. The meat shed held 2 elk he'd taken in October, frozen solid and safe from scavengers. His traps were set in a pattern he'd refined over the years. He was ready for the cold, for the storms that would bury the passes until spring. He wasn't ready for visitors. Didn't expect them, didn't want them. When Buck started barking that evening, sharp and insistent, Thorne's first thought was a predator. Bear, maybe, drawn by the smell of meat, or a mountain lion. He took down his rifle, checked the load, and opened the door. The wind hit him first, bitter and fierce, carrying ice crystals that stung his face. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with the promise of heavy snow. The temperature had been dropping all day. Buck stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, barking toward the trail that led down from the pass. Thorne stepped out, rifle ready, squinting into the gathering dusk. For a moment he saw nothing. Then a shape emerged from the tree line, a figure, moving slowly, stumbling. Too small for a bear. Human. His first instinct was to go back inside and bar the door. Travelers sometimes got lost in these mountains, especially when weather came on fast. But that was their problem, not his. He'd learned long ago that opening your door to strangers brought nothing but trouble. The figure came closer, and Thorne could see it was a woman, an old woman, bent against the wind, clutching a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. Her dress was thin, completely inadequate for this weather. No pack, no supplies that he could see. She was going to die out here if she didn't find shelter, and soon. She reached the edge of his clearing and stopped, swaying on her feet. Buck had stopped barking, whining now, uncertain. The woman raised her head, and even in the dim light, Thorne could see her face was grey with cold, her lips blue. She looked at him directly, and her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, but he heard it clearly. "Please," she said. "Please let me stay. Just one night." Thorne stood there, his hand tight on the rifle, every instinct screaming at him to refuse. He'd turned away drifters before, sent them back down the mountain with directions to Ridgeline. It was cruel, maybe, but it was his choice, his life, his right to be left alone. But something in her eyes stopped him cold, a look of recognition, almost, as if she knew him, as if she'd come here not by accident, but by intention, seeking him specifically. The wind gusted harder, and the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The woman's knees buckled, and she went down in the snow, still looking at him with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to the man he'd been 20 years ago. Thorne cursed under his breath. Then he propped his rifle against the doorframe and went to help her. She was heavier than she looked, dead weight in his arms as he carried her inside. Her skin was ice-cold where he touched her wrist, checking for a pulse. It was there, faint and irregular, but there. Buck followed them in, whining and circling as Thorne kicked the door shut against the wind. He laid her on his bed, the only place that made sense, and began working quickly. Her boots, first old leather, cracked and worn through in places. Her feet inside, wrapped in rags that were soaked through. Frostbite on 3 toes that he could see, the skin waxy white. Her hands were worse, fingers stiff and discolored. He'd seen frostbite before, knew that she'd likely lose at least a few digits if she lived long enough for it to matter. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. He built it back up, adding wood until flames licked high and heat began to fill the cabin. Then he filled a pot with water from his barrel and set it near the fire to warm, not too hot. You didn't warm frozen flesh too quickly, or you'd make the damage worse. He pulled the bearskin over her, tucking it around her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, her face slack. She could still die, he knew. Sometimes people got too cold, and their bodies just gave up even after you brought them inside. There wasn't much he could do about that except wait and hope her constitution was stronger than she looked. While the water warmed, he studied her face. She was old, 70 at least, maybe more. Deep lines around her eyes and mouth, her skin weathered like someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. Her hair, visible beneath a thin scarf, was white and sparse. She wore a plain dress that might have been brown once, but had faded to an uncertain grey, patched in multiple places. No jewelry, no adornment of any kind. Everything about her spoke of poverty, of hardship, of a long life that hadn't been easy, but those eyes, when she'd looked at him outside, there'd been something in those eyes that had struck him like a blow. Recognition, knowledge, as if she knew exactly who he was. He didn't recognize her, or didn't think he did, but memory was a strange thing, especially after 20 years. When the water was warm enough, he soaked cloths and began the slow work of warming her hands and feet. She moaned softly, not waking but registering the pain as sensation returned to frozen tissue. He worked patiently, methodically, the way he'd learned during his years as a ranger when men came in from winter patrols with frozen extremities. An hour passed. Then another. The storm outside intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners, snow piling against the shuttered windows. Whatever else happened, she wasn't leaving tonight. The storm had trapped them together as surely as if he'd locked the door. Finally, her eyelids fluttered. She made a small sound, confused, trying to orient herself. Thorne stepped back, giving her space, waiting. Her eyes opened fully and found him where he sat in his chair a few feet from the bed. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then she spoke, her voice rough and dry. "You brought me inside. Didn't have much choice," Thorne said. "You collapsed at my door. You could have left me there. Could have." He didn't explain why he hadn't, wasn't entirely sure himself. She tried to sit up, gasped at the pain in her hands and feet, and fell back against the pillow. "How bad?" "Bad enough. You'll likely lose some toes, maybe a finger or two. But you'll live if infection doesn't set in." She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this, then opened them again. "Thank you." Thorne didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked, "Who are you? What are you doing up here?" "My name is Martha," she said. "Martha Henley." The name meant nothing to him. He waited for her to continue. "I came looking for you," she said quietly. "For Thorne. You are Thorne, aren't you? Thorne Mercer?" Something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in his chest. He hadn't heard his full name spoken aloud in years. In Ridgeline, he was just Thorne. No surname, no history. "How do you know that name?" "I knew you," Martha said, "a long time ago. You wouldn't remember me, but I knew your wife, Catherine." Thorne stood abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. Buck lifted his head, alert to the sudden tension. "You don't talk about her. You understand? You don't say her name in this cabin." Martha held his gaze, unflinching despite her weakened state. "I have to. That's why I'm here. That's why I traveled 3 days through these mountains, at my age, knowing I might die trying to reach you. Because I made a promise to Catherine, and I've waited 20 years to keep it. You're lying." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. How would she know Catherine's name? How would she have found him here, in this remote place where he'd buried himself deliberately? "I'm not lying," Martha said. "I lived near you, back when you had your ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. I was a neighbor, not close by my husband, and I lived about 10 miles west, where Blackfoot Creek runs into the valley, but close enough that I knew Catherine. We'd visit sometimes, trade goods, help each other during harvest." Thorne's mind raced, trying to pull up memories from 20 years ago. He remembered some neighbors, vaguely, a few families scattered throughout the valley, but he'd been gone so much, riding patrol, and Catherine had managed most of the social connections. "If you knew us, then you know what happened," he said, his voice hard. "You know she died. You know my son disappeared. So what promise could you possibly have to keep?" "The promise to tell you the truth," Martha said. "About what really happened. About your son." The room tilted. Thorne gripped the back of the chair to steady himself. "My son is dead, or lost. It's been 20 years. Your son is alive." 3 words. 3 simple words that punched through the armor Thorne had spent 2 decades building. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The cabin walls seemed to close in around him. "You're lying," he managed finally. "People looked. I looked. For 2 years I searched everywhere." "They lied to you," Martha said, and her voice was gentle but firm. "The people who told you he was gone, that they didn't know where he was. They lied. He was taken in by a family, yes, but they didn't move west. They stayed in the territory. Your son grew up less than 100 miles from where you lost him." Thorne's legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He sank into the chair, his mind reeling. "Why? Why would anyone lie about that?" "It's complicated," Martha said, "and the telling of it will take time. I need you to listen, really listen, without interrupting. Can you do that?" He wanted to shake her, to demand she tell him everything right now, immediately. But he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way even these few minutes of conversation had depleted her. She needed rest, food, time to recover enough to tell whatever story she'd come here to tell. "Tomorrow," he said, forcing the word out. "You'll tell me tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Martha agreed. She paused, then added, "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I swear to you, Thorne, everything I'm about to tell you is the truth. I've carried it for too long. It's time you knew." Thorne didn't answer. He stood and moved to the fire, staring into the flames, his back to her. Behind him, he heard her shift in the bed, settling into sleep or trying to. His son was alive. The words echoed in his head, impossible and undeniable at once. After 20 years of believing the worst, of accepting that he'd lost everything that mattered, this stranger had walked out of a snowstorm to tell him it was all a lie. He should have been filled with hope. Instead, what he felt was rage. Rage at the years stolen from him, rage at whoever had lied, rage at this woman who'd waited 2 decades to bring him this news. But underneath the rage was something else, something he'd thought dead long ago, a small, desperate spark of hope that terrified him more than anything he'd faced in these mountains. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Thorne stood by the fire, watching shadows dance on the cabin walls, and wondered if morning would bring salvation or just another kind of loss. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, watching Martha breathe, watching the fire burn down and building it up again, watching the darkness beyond the windows gradually pale toward dawn. And in his mind, he repeated two words over and over, like a prayer or a curse. He couldn't tell which. Alive. Alive. Martha's hands shook as she pulled out the last items from her bag. A bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was brittle, crackling softly as she carefully untied the ribbon and spread the letters on the bed between them. Catherine wrote these during the last week of her life, Martha said. She was too weak to leave the house, too sick to do much of anything. But she could still write, at least at first. She wrote to you, Thorne. Wrote letters she hoped would reach you on the patrol route, letters that would bring you home before... Her voice broke. Thorne reached for the letters with hands that didn't feel like his own. The top one was addressed in Catherine's handwriting, careful and neat, despite what must have been her weakening condition. "To my beloved Thorne," it read. He couldn't open it. Not yet. His throat was too tight, his eyes burning. After a moment, Martha spoke again. "She never got to send them. She gave them to me 2 days before she died, made me promise I'd get them to you somehow. But by the time you returned, she was already buried and Samuel was gone, and my husband—" She stopped, started again. "My husband took the letters from me, said they'd only cause trouble. He locked them in his office and I couldn't get to them, not until after he died 5 years ago. Then I found them, read them, and understood just how much we'd all betrayed you." Thorne forced himself to open the first letter. The paper whispered against his fingers as he unfolded it. "My dearest Thorne," Catherine's words began, and he could hear her voice in his mind, soft and warm. "I don't know if this letter will reach you in time. I am very sick and getting worse each day. The doctor came yesterday and said there was nothing more he could do. I am frightened, not for myself but for Samuel. He is so young and he needs his father." Thorne's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forced himself to keep reading. "There is something I must tell you, something I have kept from you because I didn't want to worry you while you were away. James Cartwright has been pressuring us to sell the ranch. His offers were generous at first, but when I kept refusing, he became threatening. He said we would regret standing in the way of progress, that the Bitterroot Valley would be his, one way or another." Cartwright. Thorne knew the name, though he'd never met the man personally. James Cartwright had been one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory, with political connections that reached all the way to Washington. He'd built an empire, buying up land, sometimes fairly, sometimes through methods that were less than honest. "Last week," the letter continued, "2 of his men came to the house. They said this was our final chance to sell. I told them no, that you and I had built this ranch together and we would never give it up. They left angry. The next day, I became ill." Thorne's hands clenched, crumpling the edges of the paper. He forced himself to relax his grip, to keep reading. "I may be imagining things in my fevered state, but I believe they poisoned me, Thorne. The water tasted strange that morning, bitter, and within hours I was so sick I couldn't stand. I didn't drink from the well again after that, but the damage was already done. Whatever they put in the water, it's killing me slowly." The words swam before his eyes. He looked up at Martha. "Cartwright poisoned her? Over a land dispute?" "It looks that way," Martha said quietly. "The next letter is even more explicit. She was certain by then, and she knew she was dying." Thorne picked up the second letter. The handwriting was shakier, harder to read. "Thorne, my love, I am worse today. I can barely hold the pen. Samuel is crying in the next room, and I cannot go to him. I cannot be the mother he needs. Please, if you receive this, come home quickly. Not for me, I think it is too late for me, but for our son. Do not let Cartwright's people take him. Do not let them have the ranch. Fight for it. Fight for Samuel. Fight for the life we built together. I know you will want vengeance when you learn what they've done to me. But more important than vengeance is protecting our son. Promise me, Thorne. Promise me you will put Samuel first." The letter ended there, the final words trailing off as if she'd been too weak to continue. Thorne set it down carefully and reached for the third letter, the last one. It was very short, just a few lines in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "I am dying. Martha is here with me. She is a good woman. Trust her. The pocket watch is for you. The little horse is for Samuel. Tell him his mother loved him more than life itself. Tell him—" The sentence didn't finish. Catherine must have lost the strength to write more, or perhaps time had simply run out. Thorne stared at those final incomplete words, at the message she'd tried so hard to leave him, and something inside him broke open. Not cleanly, not with the release of tears, but with a jagged violence that felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. "She knew," he said, his voice raw. "She knew she was dying, and she knew why, and she spent her last days trying to warn me, trying to protect Samuel, and none of it mattered because the letters never reached me." "I'm sorry," Martha whispered. "I'm so sorry." Thorne stood, walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the world was pristine white, beautiful, and indifferent to human suffering. Cartwright killed my wife for a piece of land. And then what? He took the ranch anyway? "Yes," Martha said. "After you left, after you disappeared into the mountains searching for Samuel, Cartwright's lawyers claimed the property was abandoned. They took it through legal channels, neat and clean. By the time anyone might have questioned it, you were long gone, and there was no one to contest the claim. And my son ended up with the Garretts. That's convenient. Were they part of it too?" Martha hesitated, and in that hesitation, Thorne had his answer. "Thomas Garrett worked for Cartwright," she said finally. "Not directly, but he did business with him, sold him tools and equipment. When the situation with Samuel came up, when the question arose of what to do with the orphaned boy, Thomas volunteered to take him. Said it was Christian charity. But my husband told me later, in a moment when he'd had too much whiskey, that Cartwright paid the Garretts to take Samuel. Paid them well, to ensure the boy disappeared into their family and you never found him. Why?" The question came out as almost a roar. Buck whined and pressed against Thorne's leg. "Why would Cartwright care what happened to Samuel? He already had the land. He'd already won." "Because you were still out there," Martha said, searching, asking questions. "As long as you were looking for your son, there was a chance you'd talk to the right people, find out the truth, come back for revenge. But if Samuel disappeared completely, if you could never find any trace of him, eventually you'd give up. You'd accept that he was gone. And you did, didn't you? You came up here to these mountains and you hid yourself away, and Cartwright never had to worry about you again." Thorne turned from the window, his face hard. "Is Cartwright still alive?" "No, he died 8 years ago. But his son runs the business now, controls most of the Bitterroot Valley and half the territory besides. He's even more powerful than his father was. And Samuel lives in Havens Creek. How far is that from Cartwright's holdings?" Martha's face paled. "Havens Creek is right in the middle of Cartwright territory. The town exists because of the Cartwright Ranch and the businesses that serve it." Understanding dawned, cold and clear. Samuel grew up surrounded by the people who killed his mother and stole his heritage. He works for them, probably trades with them, lives his whole life not knowing that everything he has is built on the grave of his real family. "Yes," Martha whispered. Thorne looked down at the letters spread across his bed, at the pocket watch still warm in his hand, at the wooden horse that represented all the years he'd lost with his son. Then he looked at Martha. This dying woman who'd carried these secrets until they'd nearly destroyed her. "You came here to tell me this, knowing what I'd do," he said, "knowing I'd go after them." "I came here to tell you the truth," Martha corrected gently. "What you do with it is your choice." "But Thorne, Catherine asked you to put Samuel first, to protect him, not avenge her. If you go looking for justice or revenge, you might put your son in danger. You might lose the only chance you have to know him." She was right. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to go to Samuel, introduce himself, try to build some kind of relationship from the ashes of the past. Forget about Cartwright, forget about justice, just focus on the future. But Catherine's letters lay between them, proof of a crime unpunished, of a murder covered up, of a life stolen. And Thorne didn't know if he was big enough to let that go. They spent the rest of that day in careful conversation, Martha filling in details, answering questions, painting a picture of the 20 years Thorne had missed. She told him about Samuel's childhood with the Garretts, about his marriage to Emma, about his 3 children. She described Havens Creek, the layout of the town, where Samuel's smithy stood. She told him what she knew about the current Cartwright Daniel, the son, who ran his father's empire with the same ruthless efficiency but more sophisticated methods. As evening approached, Martha's strength began to fail. The journey had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, and the frostbite damage was worse than Thorne had hoped. He made her comfortable, fed her warm broth, and watched as she drifted in and out of fevered sleep. That night, while Martha slept, Thorne pulled out his old leather journal from beneath his bedroll. He hadn't opened it in 15 years, had been afraid to face the man he'd been before everything fell apart. Now he forced himself to read his own words from decades past. The early entries were mundane, notes about building the ranch, about cattle prices, about the weather. Then Catherine appeared in the pages, first as "met a woman named Catherine," and then pages later asked Catherine to marry me. She said yes. The entries became warmer after that, filled with small domestic details that seemed impossibly precious now. Catherine planted roses by the front door, fixed the fence in the north pasture. Catherine says she's with child. Then Samuel was born, and the entries changed again. Thorne barely recognized the man who'd written these words, this person who worried about fevers and teething, who carved toys by firelight, who wrote things like, "Samuel took his first steps today." Catherine cried with joy. The last entry was dated the day before he'd left on that final patrol. "Heading north tomorrow. Should be back in 4 to 6 weeks. Catherine made me promise to be careful. Samuel gave me his wooden horse to take with me for luck. I gave it back and told him to keep it safe until I returned. He's growing so fast. By the time I get back, he'll probably be even taller." Thorne closed the journal carefully. That man, the one who'd written those words, seemed like a stranger now. But maybe he didn't have to be. Maybe there was a way to find some piece of that person again, to become someone his son wouldn't be ashamed to know. He looked at the items Martha had brought, the letters, the watch, the wooden horse. Then he reached up to the shelf and took down the map he kept of the territory. By lantern light he traced the route to Havens Creek. 3 days' ride in good weather, maybe 4 with the fresh snow. He'd need to take Martha to Ridgeline first, make sure she had medical care. That was another 2 days, there and back. A week, maybe a bit more, and he could be standing in front of his son. The thought terrified him more than any blizzard or mountain lion ever had. In the morning, Martha woke clearer-headed, but visibly weaker. She saw Thorne preparing supplies, packing saddlebags, and understood what he was doing. "You're going to him," she said. "After I get you to Ridgeline. You need a doctor." "I'm dying anyway, Thorne. Don't delay for me." "I'm not leaving you here to die alone in my cabin," he said firmly. "We'll go to Ridgeline together. Then I'll continue to Havens Creek." Martha reached into her bag one last time and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a map I drew showing exactly where Samuel's smithy is, where his house is, the best way to approach the town. And this, she produced another small envelope, is a letter I wrote to Samuel. It explains everything, tells him who you are, asks him to listen to your story. If things go badly when you first meet him, if he doesn't believe you, give him this letter. Thorne took both items, tucking them carefully into his coat pocket. Thank you, for all of it, for having the courage to come find me. I only wish I'd had the courage 20 years ago, Martha said softly. I wasted so much time being afraid. We both did, Thorne replied, but maybe it's not too late to make it right. They left the next morning, Thorne leading his horse with Martha bundled on its back, Buck ranging ahead through the snow. The journey down the mountain was slow and treacherous, but Thorne knew every switchback, every hidden danger. They made camp one night in a sheltered hollow, and Martha told him more stories about Samuel, how he'd been a quiet child, thoughtful and kind, how he'd loved working with his hands, even when he was small. He's a good man, she said, staring into their small fire. Despite everything that happened, despite the lies he was raised on, he became a good man. You would be proud of him. I already am, Thorne said. I just hope I get the chance to tell him that. They reached Ridgeline, late the following afternoon. Thorne took Martha straight to Doc Morrison, the closest thing the settlement had to a real physician. Morrison took one look at Martha's frostbitten hands and feet and shook his head gravely. She'll lose the toes for certain, probably 2 fingers, and she's got pneumonia setting in from the cold. At her age, he left the thought unfinished. Do what you can for her, Thorne said. I'll pay whatever it costs. He left Martha in Morrison's care and went to the trading post. Edward Garrett was behind the counter, same as always, a stocky man in his 60s with shrewd eyes. He looked up as Thorne entered, and something flickered across his face, recognition maybe, or guilt. Thorne, Garrett said carefully, haven't seen you in a few months. Need supplies? Thorne walked up to the counter and placed both hands flat on the worn wood, leaning forward. I know about Samuel. The color drained from Garrett's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Your brother Thomas took my son, raised him as his own. And you knew where he was all this time. Every time I came in here to trade. You knew, and you never said a word. Garrett's mouth opened, closed. He looked toward the door as if contemplating running. It wasn't my decision. Thomas wanted it that way. Said the boy was better off not knowing. That wasn't your call to make, Thorne said, his voice low and dangerous. None of you had the right to decide that. What are you going to do? Garrett asked, and he looked genuinely frightened. Thorne straightened up. I'm going to Havens Creek. I'm going to meet my son. And if you ever want to look me in the eye again, you'll tell me everything you know about the Cartwrights and what they did to my family. Garrett swallowed hard, then nodded. Come to the back room. There's some things you should know before you go to Havens Creek. Some things about Daniel Cartwright and the kind of man he is. If you're planning to confront him, you need to be prepared. Thorne followed Garrett into the back room, and for the next hour he learned just how deep the corruption ran and how dangerous the path ahead might be. Edward Garrett's back room smelled of old leather and tobacco. He poured 2 whiskeys without asking and pushed one across the table to Thorne. His hands were shaking slightly. I want you to know something first, Garrett said, not meeting Thorne's eyes. Thomas didn't want to deceive you, not at first. He thought he was doing right by the boy, giving him a home when everyone believed you were never coming back. But then Cartwright made it very clear that Thomas was to keep his mouth shut. And Thomas had debts. Cartwright owned those debts. So Thomas did what he was told, same as most people do when Cartwright tells them to do something. You're making excuses, Thorne said flatly. I'm giving you context. There's a difference. Garrett took a long drink. What I'm about to tell you, I've never told another living soul. And if it gets back to Cartwright that I talked, I'm a dead man. You understand? I understand. Garrett pulled out a tin box from a shelf and set it on the table between them. Inside were papers, documents, what looked like old correspondence. He sorted through them until he found what he was looking for, a letter on expensive stationery, the ink faded but still legible. "This is from James Cartwright to my brother, dated about 3 months after your wife died. Thomas kept it hidden, but after he passed, I found it among his things. Read it." Thorne took the letter. The handwriting was educated, precise. "Thomas," it began, "I trust the boy is settling in well with your family. I want to reiterate the importance of maintaining absolute discretion regarding his origins. The father, should he resurface, must never be given reason to believe the child can be found. This is essential to our continued business relationship and, indeed, to your family's continued prosperity in this territory. I am prepared to be generous to those who demonstrate loyalty. Conversely, I have little patience for those who prove themselves unreliable. You have always been a sensible man. I trust you will continue to be so." It was signed simply, Cartwright. The letter was a threat wrapped in polite language. Thorne set it down carefully, his jaw tight. "He paid your brother to hide my son, and threatened him to make sure he stayed hidden. Yes, but there's more." Garrett pulled out another document, this one official-looking, with seals and signatures. "This is a deed transfer, your ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. It was transferred to James Cartwright 6 months after Catherine died for $1. $1, Thorne. The legal language makes it look like a legitimate sale, but we both know it was theft." Thorne stared at the deed, at his own signature forged at the bottom of the page. The rage that filled him was cold and focused, the kind of anger that didn't explode, but instead condensed into something hard and sharp. "And the current Cartwright, Daniel, he's running the same operation his father did?" "Worse," Garrett said. "Daniel's smarter, more careful. He's expanded the family holdings to cover most of the Valley territory. He controls the law, the politics, the commerce. People who oppose him have a way of losing their property or their businesses, or worse. There was a rancher 2 years back, refused to sell to Cartwright. His barn burned down with his prize horses inside. Another man, a shop owner, spoke out about Cartwright's business practices. He fell down some stairs and broke his neck. Daniel was nowhere near either incident, of course. Never is. And Samuel works in this man's territory, not knowing the truth. Samuel doesn't know anything about any of this. He believes his parents died of fever, that the Garretts took him in out of kindness. He grew up grateful to them, loyal to the community they were part of. He does work for Cartwright's ranch, same as everyone in Havens Creek does, in one way or another. There's no avoiding it." Thorne stood, paced the small room. Buck, who'd been lying by the door, lifted his head to watch. "If I tell Samuel the truth, it puts him in danger. If Cartwright finds out I've come back, that I know what his father did, he'll see you as a threat," Garrett finished. "And he'll eliminate that threat however he needs to. You have to be smart about this, Thorne. You can't just ride into Havens Creek and start making accusations. Cartwright has the sheriff in his pocket, has the judge, has everyone who matters. Then, how do I get justice for Catherine? How do I get back what was stolen from me?" Garrett leaned back, studying Thorne. "You want the truth? You probably can't. Not the way you're thinking. Cartwright is too powerful, too protected. The best you can do is maybe build a relationship with your son, try to make up for the years you lost. Going after Cartwright will only get you killed, and then Samuel will have lost you twice." The words echoed what Martha had said. Put Samuel first. Don't risk everything for revenge. It was sensible advice, wise advice. But Thorne looked at that forged deed, at Cartwright's threatening letter, and he didn't feel sensible or wise. He felt like a man who'd lost 20 years to a rich man's greed and another man's cowardice, and he wasn't sure he could just walk away from that. "There's something else," Garrett said quietly. "Something I debated whether to tell you. But you're going to find out anyway once you get to Havens Creek, so you might as well hear it from me." "What?" "Daniel Cartwright's wife is Emma. Emma Cartwright. She's Samuel's wife." The room tilted. Thorne grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. Samuel married Cartwright's daughter. Stepdaughter, technically. Emma was from her mother's first marriage, but Daniel raised her, considers her his own. The marriage between Samuel and Emma was actually Daniel's idea. He pushed for it, arranged for them to meet. I always wondered why he took such an interest in your son's life. Now I think I understand. He wanted to keep Samuel close, Thorne said slowly. To control him the way his father controlled the Garretts, by making him family. That's my guess. Samuel's a good blacksmith, reliable, honest. Daniel probably saw an opportunity to tie him into the Cartwright family permanently. And Samuel, not knowing any of this history, probably thought he was lucky to marry into such a prominent family. Thorne sank back into his chair. The complexity of the situation was suffocating. His son wasn't just living in Cartwright territory, he was married into the Cartwright family. The man whose father had murdered Samuel's real mother was now his father-in-law. The poison of that old crime had spread through the years, touching everything, connecting everyone in ways that couldn't be easily untangled. If I tell Samuel the truth, Thorne said, thinking it through, it doesn't just affect him. It affects his wife, his children, his whole life. He'll have to choose between his family and justice for a mother he doesn't remember and a father he's never known. Yes, Garrett said simply. That's exactly the position you'll be putting him in. Thorne stood and moved to the small window overlooking Ridgeline's main street. Snow had started falling again, light and steady. Somewhere out there, 3 days' ride away, his son was living a life built on lies, surrounded by the people who destroyed his original family. And Thorne had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Behind him, Garrett spoke again. My brother's deathbed confession is in that box too. Might be something you want to read before you make your decision. Thorne turned. What did he confess? That he'd seen Catherine's body. That the doctor who examined her had been paid by Cartwright to list the cause of death as fever. But the doctor told Thomas the truth, that her symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. Thomas knew your wife was murdered. He knew, and he took the blood money anyway, and he raised your son on lies to protect himself. Garrett's voice was heavy with shame. He died with that guilt eating him alive. The last thing he said to me was, find Thorne if you can. Tell him the truth. But I was a coward. I didn't do it. Not until Martha forced the issue by going up that mountain herself. Thorne moved to the box and found the confession, written in a shaky hand, dated 2 days before Thomas Garrett's death. He read it standing there, each word confirming what Martha had told him, adding new details about the doctor's report, about the amount Cartwright had paid, about how Thomas had convinced himself he was doing the right thing for Samuel, even as he accepted money to hide a murder. When he finished reading, Thorne carefully placed all the documents back in the tin box and closed the lid. Then he looked at Edward Garrett for a long moment. I'm going to Havens Creek, he said finally. I'm going to meet my son, and then I'm going to decide what to do about Daniel Cartwright. But whatever I decide, I want you to know that your brother's cowardice and yours cost me 20 years with my son. That's not something I'm going to forget. Garrett nodded, his face drawn. I don't expect you to. I just hope you'll think about Samuel before you do anything that can't be undone. He's innocent in all of this. Don't make him pay for what our families did. Thorne walked to the door, Buck rising to follow. He paused with his hand on the handle. Can I take that box? The documents might matter if things go badly. Take it. It's evidence of crimes, even if the law won't act on them. Maybe it'll be useful somehow. Thorne took the box and left the trading post. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, covering Ridgeline in fresh white. He stood there for a moment, feeling the cold on his face, thinking about all the ways the past had reached forward to poison the present. Then he headed back to Doc Morrison's to check on Martha before preparing for the final leg of his journey. Martha was sleeping. When Thorne returned to Doc Morrison's small clinic, Morrison met him at the door, his expression grave. She's fading, the doctor said quietly. The pneumonia is in both lungs now, and her heart's weak. I'd be surprised if she makes it through the week. Can she travel? Absolutely not. Moving her now would kill her within hours. Thorne nodded, accepting this. He'd known, really, that Martha's journey to his cabin had been one way. She'd climbed that mountain knowing she wouldn't come back down, or if she did, it would only be to die in slightly more comfortable surroundings. Can I see her? She's been asking for you. Go ahead. Martha's eyes opened when Thorne entered the small room where she lay. She looked impossibly frail against the white sheets, her skin papery and thin. But her eyes were clear, focused. You talked to Garrett, she said. It wasn't a question. I did. He told me about Daniel Cartwright. About Emma. Martha's mouth tightened. I wanted to tell you before you left, but I wasn't sure how. I was afraid it would change your mind about going. It should change my mind. Samuel's married into the family that destroyed ours. How do I tell him that? How do I ask him to choose? You don't ask him to choose, Martha said firmly. You give him the truth and let him decide what to do with it. That's all any of us can do, offer the truth and trust people to handle it with wisdom. Thorne pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to talk to people, especially not about something like this. What if I say it wrong? What if I make everything worse? You won't, Martha said. You're a good man, Thorne. You always were. That's why Catherine loved you. That's why she wanted Samuel to know you. She reached out with her bandaged hand, and Thorne took it gently. Promise me something. Promise me you'll tell Samuel about his mother. Not just how she died, but who she was. Tell him about her laugh, her garden, the way she sang while she worked. Give him the memories he should have had. I promise. And promise me you won't let revenge consume you. Catherine asked you to put Samuel first. Honor that request. Whatever else happens with Cartwright, don't lose your son again trying to settle old debts. Thorne couldn't promise that, and Martha seemed to know it. She squeezed his hand weakly. At least think about it. Think about what matters more, punishing the guilty or building something with the innocent. They sat in silence for a while, Thorne holding Martha's hand, listening to her labored breathing. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I'm glad I went up that mountain, even if it kills me, even if it was too late to undo the damage. I'm glad I told you. I can die knowing I kept my promise to Catherine. That's worth something. It's worth everything, Thorne said quietly. You gave me back my son, even if I haven't met him yet. You gave me truth when I'd been living on lies. That took courage. It took too long, Martha said, but better late than never, I suppose. Her eyes closed, exhaustion claiming her. Go to Havens Creek, find Samuel. Give him the wooden horse and tell him his mother carved it before he was born. Tell him. She drifted into sleep before finishing the thought. Thorne sat with her a while longer, then gently released her hand and stood. At the door, Doc Morrison was waiting. Will you stay? The doctor asked. No, she knows where I'm going. If she wakes, tell her I'll come back and tell her how it went. Tell her I'll bring Samuel to meet her if I can. Morrison nodded, though both men knew Martha probably wouldn't live long enough for that meeting. Some promises were made knowing they couldn't be kept, but they mattered anyway. Thorne spent the rest of that day preparing. He bought supplies from Garrett's trading post, not because he wanted to give the man any business, but because it was the only option in Ridgeline. He checked his weapons, cleaned his rifle, sharpened his knife. He packed the tin box of documents carefully in his saddlebag, along with Catherine's letters and the wooden horse. That evening, he retrieved his old journal and made his first entry in 15 years. The words came slowly, awkwardly, like trying to speak a language he'd once known fluently, but had forgotten. Tomorrow I ride to Havens Creek to meet my son. I am more frightened than I have been in 20 years. Not of physical danger, but of rejection, of seeing in his eyes that I am too late, that too much time has passed, that the gap between us is too wide to cross. But Martha came all that way to give me this chance. Catherine died hoping I would find him. I owe it to both of them to try, no matter how it ends." He closed the journal and sat by the small fire in the room he'd rented above the saloon. Buck lay at his feet, sensing his master's tension. Thorne found himself thinking about the man he'd been 20 years ago, the one who'd written those early journal entries full of hope and domestic happiness. Could he find his way back to being someone capable of connection, or had isolation changed him too fundamentally? He pulled out the wooden horse and turned it over in his hands. Such a simple thing, roughly carved, worn smooth by a child's touch. But it connected him to Samuel across the years, a tangible link to the father he'd been and might be again. In the morning, Thorne woke before dawn. He checked on Martha one more time. She was sleeping, her breathing shallow, and left a small bag of coins with Doc Morrison to cover her care. Then he saddled his horse, secured his supplies, and rode out of Ridgeline as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. The trail to Havens Creek wound through high valley country, passing scattered homesteads and small settlements. The snow from the recent storm had mostly melted at these lower elevations, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous in places. Thorne took his time, unwilling to rush toward a destination that both pulled and terrified him. On the second day, he passed through a small town where he stopped to water his horse and rest. An old man sitting outside the general store struck up a conversation, asking where Thorne was headed. "Havens Creek," Thorne said. "Cartwright country," the old man observed. "You got business there?" "Personal business." The old man studied him with shrewd eyes. "Word of advice, stranger. Daniel Cartwright don't take kindly to people stirring up trouble in his territory. You planning to stir up trouble might want to reconsider. I'm just looking to meet someone. That's all." "Uh-huh." The old man didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. "Well, Havens Creek's a nice enough town if you stay on Cartwright's good side. Just remember, he's always watching, always knows who comes and goes. Man like you, stranger with that look in his eyes, he'll notice you for sure." Thorne thanked him for the advice and rode on, but the warning stayed with him. If Cartwright was as controlling as everyone suggested, then Thorne's arrival wouldn't go unnoticed. He'd have to be careful, would have to find a way to meet Samuel without drawing attention, at least initially. On the evening of the third day, he crested a rise and saw Havens Creek spread out in the valley below. It was larger than he'd expected, maybe 300 people, with a proper main street, church steeple, and numerous businesses. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could see the glow of lamplight beginning to appear in windows as dusk settled. Somewhere down there was his son. The thought made his chest tight. Thorne made camp in a grove of cottonwoods about a mile from town, not ready yet to ride in. He needed time to think, to prepare himself. He built a small fire and cooked a simple meal, though he barely tasted it. Buck sensed his anxiety and stayed close, occasionally pressing his head against Thorne's leg in wordless support. As darkness fell completely, Thorne pulled out Martha's hand-drawn map and studied it by firelight. She'd marked Samuel's smithy clearly on the east side of town, near the livery stable. His house was 3 streets over, a small property with a garden. Martha had even noted which windows belonged to which rooms, information she must have gathered through careful observation during her own visits to the town. Tomorrow, Thorne decided. Tomorrow morning he would ride into Havens Creek, find the smithy, and meet his son. He would carry the wooden horse in his pocket, have Catherine's letters in his saddlebag as proof. He would try to find the right words to explain 20 years of absence, 20 years of lies, 20 years of grief and isolation. And if Samuel turned him away, refused to believe him, cursed him for a father who'd abandoned him, well, Thorne would have to accept that. He'd have to live with having tried and failed, which was perhaps worse than never trying at all, but it was what honor demanded, what Catherine's memory demanded, what the man he'd once been would have demanded of himself. He sat by the fire long after it burned down to coals, watching the distant lights of Havens Creek, imagining his son's life playing out behind those warm windows. A life, Thorne knew nothing about, filled with people and experiences and memories that didn't include him. He was about to walk into that life and turn it upside down with truth that would hurt before it could heal, if it healed at all. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead. Somewhere an owl called hunting. Thorne added more wood to the fire and settled in for what he knew would be another sleepless night. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The years of isolation, of hiding from the world, were over. Tomorrow he would step back into life, face his son, and discover whether redemption was still possible for a man who'd spent 2 decades believing he deserved nothing but solitude and regret. Buck circled 3 times and lay down beside him with a contented sigh. Thorne reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, grateful for the simple, uncomplicated loyalty. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least he wouldn't face it entirely alone. Thorne bent and picked up the wooden horse from where Samuel had thrown it. He held it out again, but this time Samuel wouldn't look at it. "I'm staying at the boarding house," Thorne said quietly. "When you're ready to hear the truth, when you're ready to see the proof I have, I'll be there. Your mother's letters, documents about what really happened, all of it." He turned and walked out before Cartwright could say anything else, before his presence could make things worse for Samuel. Behind him, he heard Cartwright's smooth voice saying something reassuring, heard Samuel's angry response, heard the smithy door close. Thorne made his way to the boarding house and took a room. From the window, he could see down the main street toward the smithy. He sat there for a long time, the wooden horse in his hands, wondering if he'd just destroyed his only chance at reconciliation by approaching Samuel so directly. The day passed slowly. Thorne ventured out only to buy supplies and check on his horse at the livery. He was aware of eyes on him, of whispers. News travelled fast in a small town, and by evening everyone would know that a stranger claiming to be Samuel Garrett's father had shown up making wild accusations. As dusk approached, there was a knock at his door. Thorne opened it to find a woman standing there, late 30s, with kind eyes and worry lines around her mouth. She held a basket covered with a cloth. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Emma, Samuel's wife." She held out the basket. "I brought you supper. May I come in?" Thorne stepped aside, surprised. Emma entered and set the basket on the small table, then turned to face him. She studied his face with an intensity that reminded him of the way Catherine used to look at people, seeing past surfaces to what lay beneath. "You look like him," she said finally. "Around the eyes, the way you hold yourself. Samuel didn't see it because he was too angry, but I see it. You believe me?" "I don't know what I believe, but Samuel came home today, shaken in a way I've never seen. He wouldn't tell me what happened at first, just kept pacing. Finally, he told me about you, about what you said. And then he locked himself in his workshop and won't come out." She sat down heavily. "Samuel's a good man, steady, reliable, kind. But he's always had this sadness in him, this sense of being alone, even when he's surrounded by family. The Garretts were good to him, raised him well, but he never quite felt like he belonged. He thought that was just who he was. But maybe it was because some part of him always knew the truth." Thorne sat across from her. "I have proof. Letters from his mother, documents about what was done to our family. I can show you." "Not yet," Emma said gently. "If you push too hard, too fast, Samuel will only dig in deeper. He's been hurt, Mr. Mercer. Whatever the truth is, learning it is going to hurt him more before it helps. You need to give him time." "I've already lost 35 years. How much more time should I give?" Emma's expression softened. "I understand, but Samuel has to come to this at his own pace. What I can do is talk to him, help him see that at least hearing you out won't cost him anything. Whether he believes you after that is up to him. Why are you helping me? You don't know me." "No," Emma agreed, "but I know Samuel, and I know he deserves the truth, whatever it is, even if that truth is painful." She paused. "There's something else you should know. My stepfather is Daniel Cartwright. When Samuel told him your name today, Daniel became very interested. He asked a lot of questions about you, about what you wanted. I saw the way he looked. It wasn't curiosity, it was concern. Like you're a threat to him somehow. I am a threat to him, Thorne said. His father murdered my wife to steal our land. I have proof of that too. Emma's face went pale. That's not possible. James Cartwright was a respected businessman. He was a murderer. And your stepfather helped cover it up by making sure Samuel disappeared into the Garrett family, where I could never find him. Emma stood abruptly, her hand pressed to her mouth. I need to go. I need to think about this. Emma, Thorne's voice stopped her at the door. Thank you for believing I deserve a chance. Thank you for helping Samuel stay open to the truth, even when it's ugly. She nodded, tears in her eyes now. He's been a good father to me. Daniel, I don't want to believe he's capable of what you're saying. But I also don't want to be the kind of person who protects evil just because it's wearing a familiar face. She opened the door, then looked back. Be patient with Samuel. He's afraid of being hurt again. We all are. After she left, Thorne opened the basket and found a hearty meal, roast chicken, bread, vegetables. He ate slowly, tasting none of it, thinking about Emma's words. About Samuel locked in his workshop, wrestling with the possibility that his entire life had been built on lies. About Cartwright, who now knew Thorne was in town and would be planning his response. The wooden horse sat on the table beside him. Tomorrow, Thorne decided, he would try again. He would be patient, as Emma suggested, but he would also be ready for whatever Cartwright might do. Because men like Daniel Cartwright didn't let threats to their power go unanswered. Outside, night fell over Havens Creek. Somewhere in this town, his son was struggling with impossible truths. And somewhere else, Daniel Cartwright was planning how to eliminate the man who could destroy everything he'd built on his father's crimes. Thorne checked his rifle and settled in to wait. 2 days passed in careful tension. Thorne stayed close to the boarding house, venturing out only for necessities. He saw Samuel once, from a distance, carrying supplies from the general store to his wagon. Their eyes met briefly across the street, and Samuel didn't look away immediately. That small hesitation gave Thorne hope. On the third morning, Samuel appeared at Thorne's door. He stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable, his hands shoved in his pockets. Emma says I should hear you out, he said without preamble. Says I owe it to myself to at least look at whatever proof you claim to have. Thorne stepped aside, letting Samuel enter. They sat across from each other at the small table, the morning light streaming through the window between them. Thorne pulled out the tin box, opened it, and began laying out the documents one by one. The letters from Catherine, the forged deed, Cartwright's threatening letter to Thomas Garrett, Thomas's deathbed confession. Samuel read slowly, his face growing paler with each page. When he reached Catherine's letters, his hands began to shake. He read them twice, touching the paper gently as if it might disintegrate beneath his fingers. She wrote these while she was dying, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. While I was in the next room, she was trying to reach you, to warn you, to protect me. Yes, and no one ever sent them. No. Samuel set the letters down carefully and looked at Thorne with Catherine's eyes. The Garretts, they lied to me my whole life. Raised me on lies, let me believe I was alone in the world when my father was alive and searching for me. They were paid to do it, threatened too. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And Daniel? Samuel's voice hardened. My father-in-law? What was his role in this? Thorne hesitated, then decided Samuel deserved the complete truth. His father murdered your mother to steal our land. Daniel helped make sure you disappeared so I could never find you and learn the truth. He arranged your marriage to Emma to keep you close, to control you. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Thorne. For long minutes he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. I have 3 children. They called Daniel grandfather. They love him. And you're telling me he's what? A criminal? A conspirator in my mother's murder? I'm telling you the truth. What you do with it is your choice." Samuel turned, and Thorne saw tears on his son's face. "What am I supposed to do? I have a life here, a business. Emma's family is woven through everything. If I confront Daniel, if I go to the law assuming the law isn't in his pocket, I destroy my children's world. But if I do nothing, I'm protecting the man who helped kill my real mother." Thorne stood and crossed to Samuel slowly, giving him space to retreat if he wanted. Samuel didn't move. Up close, Thorne could see so much of Catherine in him, the shape of his face, the way he held himself, the kindness in his eyes, even through the anger and pain. "Your mother's last words to me were to put you first," Thorne said quietly, "to protect you above everything else, including revenge. I spent 20 years in those mountains alone, and it took a dying woman climbing through a blizzard to make me understand that isolation wasn't honor, it was cowardice. I can't tell you what to do, Samuel, but I can tell you that family, real family, the kind built on truth, is worth fighting for, and you have that choice now. You can choose to know me or not. You can choose to act against Cartwright or not. But at least now, you're choosing with your eyes open." Samuel's face crumpled. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to have a father after 35 years of not having one." "Neither do I," Thorne admitted. "Neither do I know how to be a father to a grown man with his own family. But we can figure it out together if you're willing to try." For a moment, Samuel just looked at him. Then, slowly, he reached out and pulled Thorne into an embrace. It was awkward at first, two men who were strangers learning the shape of each other, but it was real. Thorne felt 35 years of grief and isolation crack open, felt tears he'd thought long dried up spilling down his face. "I looked for you," he said against Samuel's shoulder. "For 2 years, I searched everywhere. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost everything." "I know," Samuel said. "I believe you, and I'm glad you found me. Even like this, even with all this pain, I'm glad." They stood like that for a long time, father and son, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what had been stolen from them. Later, Samuel took Thorne to meet his grandchildren, the 2 boys aged 8 and 6, and a little girl of 4 who reminded Thorne achingly of Catherine. They were curious about this stranger their father introduced as family, asking questions with the directness of children. Thorne found himself smiling, laughing even, as he answered them. Emma watched from the doorway, her expression complicated. She'd learned the truth about her stepfather from Samuel, and Thorne could see her struggling with it. But she didn't turn him away. Instead, she invited him to supper. Over the following weeks, Thorne and Samuel talked for hours, building a relationship from fragments and hope. Thorne told stories about Catherine, about the ranch they'd built, about the life Samuel should have had. Samuel shared his own history, the good and the bad, the successes and struggles of growing up without knowing his real family. The question of what to do about Daniel Cartwright hung between them, unresolved. But for now, that could wait. First came healing, first came family. Thorne moved his things from the boarding house to a small cabin on Samuel's property. He still made trips to the mountains sometimes, still valued his solitude. But he always came back to Havens Creek, to his son's home, to his grandchildren's laughter. Martha died peacefully 2 weeks after Thorne reached Havens Creek. Samuel rode back to Ridgeline with him for the funeral. They buried her next to Thomas Garrett, and Samuel placed the wooden horse on her grave as thanks for the gift she'd given them both. Standing there in the cold morning, Thorne pulled out his journal, now filling with new entries about dinners with family, about teaching his grandchildren to carve wood, about slowly learning to live again, and added a final line about Martha. "She came to my door on the coldest night of winter and asked for shelter. I almost turned her away. Instead, I let her in, and she gave me back my life. Some doors, when we finally open them, lead us home." He closed the journal and looked at Samuel, at his son's strong profile against the winter sky, and felt something he'd thought lost forever. Not just hope, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. The mountain would always be there if he needed it. But for now, Thorne Mercer had finally come down from his isolation, and he wasn't going back.